What's up, everyone? We are the Thralls of Metal, bringing you another excellent Screaming Toilet review. I am Shred Lord.
Necrotic Nick.
Here today we bring you the rock to metal documentary, Come On, Feel the Noise,
I feel so violated.
by Cleopatra Entertainment.
Now, this is the same Cleopatra Entertainment that is associated with Cleopatra Records, which I had to look up because I listened to a lot of industrial way back. So, yeah, this is the same one that had Electric Hellfire Club and all that shit. This is also done by Studio Hamburg. Now, this was released here in the States in 2019, but it was actually released in Germany in 2017. So, this is a few years ago, but an interesting documentary. It pretty much just goes through the history of when rock became metal. And it really kicks off like an interesting point with like the 60s. Talk about Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin and such, kind of getting to the roots of it. Now, one thing I can say about this is it's clearly dubbed. At least the narration is. And unfortunately, the narration really doesn't capture that metal feel.
Not at all. This is the most unmetal narrator of all time. It sounds like, for anyone who's familiar with like Looper or Watch Mojo videos, it sounds like they hired the most unenthusiastic Watch Mojo narrator and put him on this documentary.
I thought this guy was going to sell me something on an infomercial or tell me about getting a second mortgage on my home.
He gave no fucks about metal.
Yeah, no. Just kind of a flat, kind of banal delivery, unfortunately. But the information was cool. They talked a lot about a German music show called, was it The
Beat?
Yeah, The Beat, which was really cool because they showcased all these different bands playing, like Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, T-Rex, all this different stuff. And it was really cool to actually see something that isn't an American take on it. This was like their club, this is their show, and it was definitely more, I would say, free. Like, in terms of just like the bands they throw on there, they really just didn't give a shit, you know, in terms of like, will this piss people off?
They just did their thing.
Yeah, whereas, you know, we had the Ed Sullivan show. Like, listen, Jim Morrison, if you could just tone it down a bit, and, well, yeah, he sure did. Yeah, he sure did.
It reminded me of, there was a British version, basically, of what we're talking about here called Top of the Pops. Basically, it was not always rock and metal, but they did a very similar thing, brought on new bands and let them play and everything. Iron Maiden's been on it before, and some other big bands from the UK.
Now, it was interesting, all the people they actually talked to in here. We get people from, like, all walks. Jimmy Page is in here. James Hetfield. They even talked to John Corabi, you know, the one-time singer of Motley Crue, who's actually kind of doing his own thing now. And his band kind of got plugged in here a little bit later, but we'll go into that as this movie goes on.
Ian Pace.
Pace.
The highlight for me, probably my favorite interview by far, was one of my biggest guitar heroes, Michael Schenker, from UFO and the Scorpions. They talked to him a little bit about everything. He's a big part of rock and heavy metal, especially over in Europe. He is a guitar hero's guitar hero from back in the day. Everybody from Kirk Hammett to Joe Satriani to any guitar player who's worth his weight in salt at least knows and respects Michael Schenker, because he was on the scene in the 70s shredding it the fuck up.
And they're really good in this documentary about splicing in live performances, or at least like a kind of a music video to give you an idea of the band they're talking about. But most of these bands aren't really necessarily underground at all. These are very well-known ones. I mean, they actually showed the Iron Man performance that we so famously see on, you know,
which I did not realize was on the Beat show.
It was really cool.
The whole video with all the crazy Technicolors and shit in the background, that's from that show, The Beat. I never knew that before that documentary, so that was kind of cool learning that.
Like, when it starts going more through the history and such, like, you know, bringing in glam rock, which I thought was kind of an interesting era, with like T-Rex and Slade, which actually I found out something new that I didn't know. The frontman for Slade was actually asked to be the frontman for AC/DC after Bon Scott died, which they labored the point that he choked on his own vomit, which is pretty much unnecessary by now because most people that know AC/DC know that that happened. But I didn't know that they actually asked him to do it, and, you know, listening to Slade, which I've listened to Slade for years, I really like those guys, he really would have been a good fit.
He would have been a great fit. I'm not the biggest fan of Slade or any of that stuff. You know, one gripe that I had about this DVD is the path that they took from rock to metal. with the punk in between. I'm not a punk fan, so I literally could have just fucking fell asleep. I could give a shit less about any of these punk bands. Sorry, it is what it is. But regardless of that, I just feel like the bands they chose to highlight and spend time on versus the band, like, they talked a lot about Led Zeppelin. Great, Led Zeppelin, definitely worth it. And then they talked for 5 seconds about Black Sabbath. Yeah. Go fuck yourself, dude. Black Sabbath is fucking better than Zeppelin, in my opinion. I wish they would have spent more time on more important bands, such as Black Sabbath. They very briefly talked about Black Sabbath. They spent a lot of time on Zeppelin, which was cool.
And Deep Purple.
Which was great, you know? But then they'd spend what felt like an eternity on the Sex Pistols or something, which is great, which is cool. But then
I thought the punk section. I mean, I thought the punk section was a little bit long, considering this was a metal documentary. But it is kind of necessary for the evolution because, I mean, punk contributes hugely to the overall sound of metal. But they kind of just glanced over each band. But I think they could have shortened it up by just bringing up the bands instead of like, okay, we have to play some songs by each band we brought up. That might have been too much there.
This is a documentary about rock and metal. They had twice as much footage on Blondie as they did on fucking Black Sabbath. What the fuck?
Yeah. I mean,
what the fuck indeed? And then we got to metal, and I like Steel Panther. They're a cool band. They're a great, parody 80s glam band. Whatever. Cool. Great guys. Great musicians. But, like, when they got to metal, that's all they really talked about. There was no fucking Megadeth, really. There was barely any mention of Metallica.
Well, they had James Hetfield.
But he was talking about shit. They didn't even really talk about. There was no Slayer. There was no Testament. They briefly talked about Motorhead. Yeah. They didn't even spend much time on Motorhead. What the fuck?
They had really cool footage of Lemmy doing Orgasmatron and practically corpse paint.
Pretty much corpse paint with no bass.
With no bass. And like honestly, it's kind of a unique performance. I really thought that was cool.
Loved it.
But all right, another one of my issues is again when we're talking about like metal. Mostly I knew they were going to talk about thrash metal, because that's pretty much where metal got a little bit more extreme. And they glanced over it. Really just glanced over it. And the person that introduces us to thrash metal in this documentary is David Draymond from Disturbed. The least thrash metal guy they possibly could have found. Now, he brought up an interesting point that I have to give him credit on about how any shock rocker owes a debt of gratitude to Alice Cooper, which they definitely brought up. Absolutely. A lot of Alice Cooper.
And rightfully so.
And rightfully so, yeah. I mean, any of those bands that, throw out, like, shocking imagery and shit, that's where you got it from. That's why it's became popular. But why him introducing thrash metal? Like, this was the section I was really looking forward to, because this was, again, where metal got more extreme, and it's just glanced over. The only band they really brought up was Anthrax, and they just talked to Scott Ian for a little bit, and then they just kind of fucked off about it and went into more modern bands that are just kind of acquired tastes.
Nick's being nice. We really hated the David Draymond interviews. Yeah. Nobody loves David more than David. David loves David, and it's annoying to watch at times.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes. No, it's 100% true. But again, like when they brought up the other bands, like talk about Life of Agony for a little bit, which I really wouldn't consider much of a metal band. They're more of just a hard rock band. And Steel Panther, which is more along the lines of parody hair metal, and then Sabaton, which I know they have a adoring fan base.
Nick cannot stand Sabaton.
I went to history class. I don't need the musical version. I love World War II and studying it. I don't need the song and dance with it. They're great musicians, I'm sure, and they seem like pretty cool guys. I just can't get into them. And they also went into Ghost, which I'm still a fan, though I really wouldn't consider much of a metal band. But they kind of lumped them in with like the modern metal thing. And at the same time, I was just thinking there are a lot of really cool modern acts out there they could have talked about. Like,
and ones that have so many good artists they could have put in this thing.
Ones that have classic influences. Like, I mean, if they talk to Mastodon, Mastodon is both kind of their own thing, but they love like the past stuff. They love Thin Lizzy. Thin Lizzy wasn't mentioned, really.
Which is stupid.
But I mean, I think the only time Thin Lizzy was mentioned was courtesy of Scott Ian. So thank you, Scott, for bringing up an awesome band there.
You're a real one, buddy.
But yeah, it just feels like a lot of stuff was kind of just glanced over. And especially towards the end. The end seemed like it just kind of picked up the pace and then became sort of a promo for what I would think were artists on that label, but they aren't. And most of these are spread out across different labels. but it just kind of lost its steam and direction. Iron Maiden, even though they were brought up, really didn't get much of a mention.
Same with Priest.
Priest got a little bit.
Priest and Maiden were barely talked about, which keeps reiterating the point. Who the fuck organized this thing, man? I appreciate the fact that they wanted to do this in the first place, but I 100% disagree with the path that they chose.
Yeah, I mean, it just got kind of aimless. There were different ways to go about it, like especially when it came down to like introducing the next subject matter, maybe have someone that's a little more tied to it. You know, I don't know, it just kind of lost its direction. And it had clear direction in the beginning. Like the beginning I thought was fascinating, and then it just kind of teetered off. So overall, I'm going to give it 2.5 stars. This is half of a really good documentary. I think there are some cool points that were brought up. I definitely have issues with the direction and the editing and how it was put together, but some of that might have been kind of lost in editing in terms of how it flowed well. But it's a so-so documentary, and it really just didn't get to a lot of bands that really helped shape the sound more later on.
I'm going to give it a 2 out of 5. I didn't care for the narration. I didn't care for the path they chose to explain from rock and metal. I didn't really care for a good 50 to 60% of the interviews that they decided to have. A lot of them just kind of felt meaningless and silly.
It was the classic ones that were actually more interesting.
Yeah,
Like the old
absolutely.
rockers.
Yeah, they had the most interesting things to say for sure. My opinion is if you want to watch a real metal documentary, follow Banger TV's Sam Dunn and watch his documentary, because that's fucking phenomenal.
Yep.
And Cleopatra Entertainment should be calling Sam up and asking him how the fuck to redo this. So 2 out of 5 for me.
So, if you like the review, give it a thumbs up. And if you are new to the channel, subscribe, because we do shit like this all the time. Catch you guys later.